Good morning, everybody. I'm Pietro Galgani, R&D manager at the True Price Impact Institute. I'm going to present the study that we did on livestock in Tanzania, together with Wageningen University and Sokoine University in Tanzania. This study built on the feeder study on livestock. There was a global study with 5 countries and 10 different systems. I'm now going to show you what was the setup of the study, some findings, and also stop a bit on the lessons learned using the TEEB framework. And I will try to keep it to 12 minutes so that you don't think of your coffee in this time. So what was the setup of our study? As I said, it built on the global study. We were asked to expand further on the Tanzanian system. And the goal in this case was really to use the agri-food framework to assess the traditional livestock systems. First of all, how do these livestock systems look today from the lens of the agri-food framework? How do technical improvements look like from this lens? And also the livestock policy. So the current livestock policy, what are the pros and cons if we use this holistic perspective? The 3 systems that we looked at, and we didn't compare the 3 systems with each other because they're really not substitute, nor for the households. They might have dairy cows and chicken at the same time, or it's not easy for pastoralists to shift entirely to poultry. Also for the policymaker, they're not really substitute because they are in different geographical areas. So what we compared it with was the current system and a potential technical improvement. I'm going to talk more about this in the afternoon session. So the 3 systems were a smallholder dairy in the Southern Highlands, which is a small farm system, but is responsible for 97% of the milk supply in the country. Backyard poultry in rural Tanzania, we look at the average of the country, and this is responsible for 70% of the rural supply of poultry meat and eggs, and also 20% of the urban supply. So these are traditional systems, but they are very widespread. And pastoralic livestock systems in the Masai steppe region of Tanzania, which is actually 90% of the country's cattle pastoralist herds, and it includes cattle, but also goats and sheep. What method did we apply to look at these systems? We had a combination of qualitative assessment and monetary assessment. So everything that we quantified, we also monetized. An economic part, an environmental part, and also looking at social and human capital. The social and human capital was mainly based on the literature review. So we expanded the global study by looking really at a lot of Tanzanian sources. And with the quantitative modeling was economic and environmental. So the economic modeling included the value chain model, where we look at the profit margin in each step of the value chain and how the consumer price is distributed between the chain actors. And the household economy model, we look at what are the costs, what are the revenues of a household, and we included sales of products, meat, eggs, milk, but also own consumption of products. And for example, for pastoralists, this also included skins and hides, and various costs, but not the cost of family labor. We consider that as included in the household income, but only the cost of hired labor. The environmental model included a biophysical model of the herd based on GLEAM, which is a global livestock environmental assessment model by the FAO. We used this to model the herd, and based on that, the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really based on the agroecological conditions of the region. And it uses the life cycle assessment approach. So it includes feeds and farm operations. And the ecosystem services model was really we already looked at ecosystem services for pastoralism in this region. It really contributes to landscape management because it's used in the regions where there is very little rain and quite poor soils. With this, we try to undertake a sort of value chain perspective and say, okay, what is the ecosystem services value per dollar of food produced? So next to food, it also produces ecosystem services. This system, what is the value? Some interesting things about the methodology that I wanted to share is that when we looked at the technical improvements, we really had a lot of interplay between looking what was the available evidence in the country, how can we use that to build a household economy model, and balance always that with what is possible biophysically from the herd size in terms of changes in yield based on, for example, animal health conditions. And that was an interesting exercise to really iterate between data availability and herd model and household economy model. And the other thing which I mentioned before was really the ecosystem services model, which the idea was to bring the natural capital valuation that we did before in the value chain perspective. So looking really at the food production and ecosystem services as a positive externality of food production. So to give you an idea, we look at what is the price of meat, beef produced by this system, and it's in this case we see from the line is $3 per kilo. And then we looked at what are the positive benefits if you compare it with the alternative in that region. So we sort of take a true cost accounting approach with but only for a local regional scope. So we say in the region, if there is no pastoralist, there are farmers, but this has implications because it closes wildlife corridors and it degrades the soil. So the research shows that if you convert to farming in the region, after 20 years, the land is degraded and abandoned. So these are the implications that we try to capture here from a value chain perspective. And we see, for example, that the carbon storage maintenance value of pastoralism is actually higher than the value of food they produce. It's $4 for every $3 of food produced. And the protection of soil fertility, because pastoralism is adapted to these poor soils and little rain, it maintains soil fertility, while the farming is shown to degrade it. This value is 50 cents for every $3 of food produced. And contribution to tourism, it means keeping, because they can coexist in the same ecosystem, food production and the wildlife herds, we said, okay, what if you attribute a share of tourism revenues based on the different contribution to the national parks? We see that it's 35 cents, so about 10% of the value of food produced. Some other findings, I'm going to focus on the cross-cutting findings, so valid for all systems. And I will go more in detail in the afternoon session. So looking at the different capitals, we could identify key problems. We started from produced capital a lot, so the agronomic model of the herd and the economic model of the household, but we also saw all the links, and the framework was quite useful in really helping us to highlight all the problems and map them. So the first one is that this system has quite low productivity. They have low access to inputs, and this means also that they are an important contribution to income, is not what we want to say, but this income is still quite low for a household. And this is linked to the fact that animal health is quite low, so this reflects into low yields. And there is also potentially impacts on human health. For example, from backyard poultry, there is a chance, it's not well understood, but the chance is there that because people and chicken live very closely together in rural areas, there could be a widespread disease. This is part of the qualitative analysis that we did. And the system have little infrastructure, so the extension service in Tanzania is not very developed, it's insufficient. And the milk value chain, for example, is very underdeveloped, so all the milk is sold raw and not refrigerated. I missed one box. Their impact on climate change was relatively high because of the low yield. And external cost of greenhouse gas, for example, was up to 3 times the retail price, from like half the retail price to about half, 3 times. And then another interesting problem that we identified is that pastoralism does have some ecosystem benefits and is also contributing to a lot of meat supply in the country, but it's a bit in conflict with the development trends in this region. For example, as we said, sedentary farming is expanding and it's pushing out pastoralism because pastoralist herds need to migrate in different seasons to go to different areas for grazing, so they need to corridors. And as the farms get fenced, these corridors get closed. And actually, there is a lot of land-related conflicts in Tanzania and pastoralist regions. Yeah, and also it's been conflict with education development, because in the traditional pastoralist way of keeping livestock, children have an important role, and this is sometimes often difficult to combine with education. So enough problems, now some positive things. These systems have a lot of benefits beyond food production, so that's the interesting thing that we want to show also to decision makers. For example, as I said, yes, their household income is low, but overall, globally, they have a really important contribution to household income. And it's not only income on a year-by-year basis, but it's also savings value of chicken, of herds, of cattle herds. This is really allows some buffer, financial buffer, for households. These systems make an important use of agricultural and food waste. So the dairy cows, they feed on agricultural waste, and the chicken, they feed exclusively on food waste. So in this way, the value chain, the input use is very low, and that's good for the value chain impact is quite low. Actually, manure is an important reason for keeping livestock for dairy farmers, smallholder farmers. Another side benefit is women empowerment. Backyard poultry in Tanzania is mainly managed by women, and women in rural contexts often have very little access to economic activity. So yes, backyard poultry has a low yield, but on the other hand, it really brings some opportunities to women, which other systems maybe would not bring. As I said before, the value chains are short in the way that they use only local inputs, but also on the way to consumers, they are quite short. So farm impact, for example, on climate point may be high, but because they use little inputs and the distance to consumer is quite short, other impacts are low, like land use and biodiversity, for example, or water pollution, or energy use in the processing chain. And finally, the other benefits that I already mentioned, the ecosystem services of pastoralism. And we're looking particularly at carbon, land degradation prevention, and contribution to tourism. So that was the summary of the findings, and for more detail, for more in-depth view, yeah, I will discuss that in the afternoon session, or you're welcome to come up to me and my colleagues, Flor, and good luck. I wanted to, yeah, just share some reflections on the use of the TEEB framework. I also start here with the bad news. Yeah, the first challenge, of course, is data. I think everybody recognized this as a researcher. But we had an interesting situation that it was both too much and too little. Too much because we had to make sense of a lot of information, and too little because at some point, we, for example, would have liked to model a farm with crops and livestock at the same time, or to model what happens if you have a really agroecological or sustainable intensification system. But these are not studied in Tanzania, so it would have been speculation, and we didn't want to do that. And maybe the data was also too early, because indeed, first we mapped all the impacts, then we did some assessment, and then we thought of some gaps that would have been interesting to fill, but we were already at an advanced stage in the process. And I think this reflects on how we use the framework if we want to have iterations of going through data collection, assessment, data collection, assessment. Synthesis means, of course, bringing the complexity into simple message. I think it has to do with the challenge of mediating the different perspectives. So in the team we had agronomists, the sociologists, the environmentalists. As Alexander said yesterday, everybody has a different view of what is actually really the problem, what is really important. And I think we really recognize this, and we see that the TEEB framework, applying this really requires dealing with this tension. And I'm also interested to hear how different people address this in a pragmatic way. And this is reflected in, for example, framing the question. I think it's very important when you look in a very holistic system, you describe it in a very holistic way. Think what kind of question are you asking, because you could ask different questions to the same framework. And I think for us it was also a sort of, at which point in the study do you define the question? The more you go forward, the more you understand the trends in the system, the strengths and the weakness, and then maybe you want to come up with a different question, but it's maybe too late. And also with messaging the results is related. So we had a lot of findings. We want to come up with, and we also were looking at 3 different value chains with different characteristics, which I said they're not interchangeable. How do we frame the results and which results should we highlight? I think this is really something that requires a lot of discussion in the team. I think some of you will recognize. And I think the interesting thing of using the framework, first of all, when we look at the technical improvements, so we looked at really technical improvements that are likely and sustainable. So we went really in a traditional, well, not in traditional, but in the typical development process. And we really could see very clearly what were the win-win opportunities. So there were some opportunities that really clearly had a positive climate impact and a positive impact on household income. And this was for cattle. So this was very interesting. But at the same time, the framework forces you to identify the side effects and to go through the checklist. Okay, but what about human capital? But what about social capital? But what about other natural capital impacts? And the other key benefits was that we look at policy, a livestock development policy, and we could really pinpoint these are the trade-offs that has to be kept in mind. These are the potential pitfalls of livestock policy. For example, I will also discuss this more in detail this afternoon, but the risk of losing the local benefits. So there are a lot of local benefits, and yes, you want to increase yield, but you don't want to lose necessarily the local benefits. The risk of overusing inputs. Yes, if you provide more inputs, you have higher yields and a lower climate impact, but at the same time, it can be too much, and it can have then a negative natural capital impact. The risk of overgrazing. So if it becomes very profitable to do milk, maybe everybody does it, and that will affect water bodies. It will create deforestation if there is too much animals. The incentives, how do you balance the short-term benefits and the long-term benefits, the local benefits and the global benefits? I think the policy should really look at both. Look indeed what's the cost of not addressing one of these. And finally, yeah, the institutional barriers to pastoralism development. So as I said, the link with land policy, the link with education policy. Yes, there are technical improvements that you can promote, and the Tanzanian government is also promoting technical improvements for pastoralist herders. But there are some institutional barriers that go beyond livestock policy, like to use more technology, you need higher education. How are you going to make sure that these herders get higher education? And also you need secure land tenure. How to make sure that there is no more land conflict. These are all the benefits that comes when you really apply this holistic framework to the typical livestock development questions. This was my last slide. So thank you for listening. Also on behalf of the research consortium which I represent. And yeah, happy to follow up after the break.
Okay, let's get seated. I think people are still kind of drifting in from outside. I think we'll have to limit this panel to about 15 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes. But let me ask an opening question to the three PIs for the studies, which is this. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, although the initial framework in 2014 already discussed value chain and already began to discuss some of the things which appeared in the final framework, there has been an evolution. So some of you already talked about this in your presentations, but if you can maybe talk about, just very briefly for 1 or 2 minutes, how the shift in framework has shifted the way you've done the work that you have. Okay? And that's the first thing. So how has it shifted your work? And then another minute on how some of you begun to think about the policy audience, and the policy audiences in the room, they'll talk to you and with you, communicate with you in a separate session, but just any reflections on how the shift in the framework, the expansion of the framework, might have affected the policy audience. So Priscilla, let me start with you.
Okay, to respond to the question on how this new framework has changed how we look at things, I would say the framework at least gives us a way to look at the value chain in a holistic way, which was not there before. Like other things are easy to overlook, especially some of the social dimensions, but with the guidance of the framework, at least you can be able to see everything in a holistic way, how everything connects to each other, and this will in turn affect policy, because a change in policy can have a change in another outcome or an output, which will have another overall change in everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for our part, the change in framework, the main implication was that we were forced to spell out human capital, social capital, a bit more in detail and more structured. So before, these capitals they were just a minor part, and now they become more central. So that was reflected also in the findings. Also in the way that we indeed assess the policy options. So we didn't just look at what we could quantify, but we did the exercise of assessing the policy option from all the things that we assessed on the social and human dimension. I think a challenge posed in talking with the policy audience with this framework is indeed in finding the right simple message for different policy decision maker.
So this shift in the framework from what we originally started with to what we eventually had to work with in this segment, I think one of the major shifts was clearly using the whole value chain, and that made it really interesting. It brought in a lot of dimensions and elements that we hadn't done originally in the first part of the Rice study. But I think the biggest shift for us, which was stressed in the foundation study, and you don't see it immediately in the framework, but I think some way of making it front and central is systems thinking. It's how important it is to have systems thinking. You can fill in all the cells in the framework, and then what do you do with it? What is the interaction between all of these different elements? And I think I was really glad that we could go in that direction in this phase, and saying it's not easy, but I think to me it was very strong to do that. And I do think that then lends itself very well to messages to policymakers. Yeah.
To ask for, just very briefly, a minute or two, your reflections on what you've heard. I know you haven't reviewed these in detail, but just on the theory of change side, any reflections that you have before I open up to the floor?
Well, I did have the chance to review the Livestock paper in its previous incarnation, and I think just having looked at that and not having looked at the other two, I see a pretty dramatic refocusing and repurposing of the analytics that previously were much more upstream. Although there was a bottom-up study in Tanzania that started the analytic. I think that it's helped to have a much more structured approach that includes all of the four capitals and that enables you to see the relationships between them. What I did miss in that study really was sort of the policy dimension of where you take it from there once you have the information. How are the stakeholders who have been identified within the process of developing that study? And I think this also passes through, although it's already pretty much more clearly identified in the other two studies, how stakeholders have been engaged in defining the variables for intervention and how they can be part of the work that's needed to take it to a next stage. Once you have identified which systems are better on some of the variables that you're looking at, what are the dimensions of say extension, communication, policy shifts, etc., that have to be considered, and how can the stakeholders who have been engaged in the process so far be engaged in taking that forward?
Peter, thank you very much. And as I said in the opening to set out the day, part of that response from policymakers happened during the course of these studies, but equally a big part is our reflections in the afternoon session in the DevCo study, which Dustin will lead, as to what you make of these, how you can disseminate them, what you need to disseminate them, okay, to make change happen. So thank you, Peter, it's very useful. Let me gather a couple of questions from the floor. We've only got about 10 minutes, and I'll ask the panelists maybe then to answer those questions. Has anyone got any questions, please, or comments? Please, sir, can you identify yourself as well?
I will speak in French, just for a change. I just wanted to make a comment about the study by Barbara and her team, which I would like to congratulate her for. And I was able to read the document, and I will be able to read the document. I'm happy to do so. Rice in Senegal is an extremely important crop. And if there are problems with the government in Senegal, just look at the rice. If there's a crisis relating to rice, that will be something that could bring down our work. So we should be able to we have 3 principal mandates: to work, to have the species so that we can have 2 types of irrigated production, and also have species that are adapted to rainy areas. So we can have millet and sorghum as well as rice. Because the issue is in Senegal, assessing the rice production is difficult, because the more people have money, the more they will consume rice, and that's changing from a millet consumption to rice consumption. And many are eating rice at lunchtime and in the evening as well. So the demand for rice has increased. We have no choice in Senegal. We have to work on our rice crops. And personally, we will do everything that we can so that this study is carried out properly, and that's what I wanted to give you as my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and I think that we'll all agree that that's very much the case, because when we decided on which commodities to focus on and in which countries, that was in 2014, we very much took into account how important those commodities are. We want to work on important commodities that affect trade, that affect livelihoods, and it's very nice that you agree with that, and it's good that we'll have further discussions with Barbara, but she can also respond when we go through. Let me take 1 or 2 further comments or questions. Questions, yep.
Mine is a contribution to Priscilla. I realize your stuff was good, but there has been a little bit new developments. Maybe you have to take note. In terms of child labor in cocoa production, this age-long issue which has been resolved. Child labor per se should not be a big issue, because we all grew through that stage. The worst forms of child labor, which is the worst part. But child labor, carrying cocoa in the basket, we don't see it as child labor. And those who did the report, we've confronted them, and I think it's been solved. And then secondly, on the production level, about $16 per certification per ton. It is way below. Fair trade sales give $200 per ton. So it gives a very incentivized farmers, producers to work on cocoa, because fair trade issues talks about biodiversity, climate change. So they are more exciting, and they are reforestation, because Ghana, they will have program on deforestation, but now there's reforestation, and farmers before there was a tree tenure arrangement which was against the farmer. Now government are giving way for farmers to own trees, so it helps in the reforestation, and that it's well spread, and there's so many programs that is being done for farmers to own trees. And when we meet in the group work, maybe we could help talk too much about that.
Perfect, thank you. So I think it's more a comment as opposed to a question, which is fine. Has anyone got any direct questions for the panel that they'd like to ask?
I didn't want to ask that question.
Yeah, please, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Tolosa from Ethiopia. I have some questions for agroprocessing, agroforestry Ethiopian coffee. My question is, from your presentation, we have seen that the discharge of wastewater when compared to international standards, they has vary, but I didn't see the national standards whether it is compatible or not. And we have different standards for environment, whether it is solid waste or liquid waste. But in your presentation, I haven't seen. So, what is the issue? That's why the government also knows the issues and the problems to be improve the standards and the legal frameworks. Additionally, coffee production in Ethiopia is mostly around south west of the country, but around the center also some farmers and the cooperatives who produce coffee. For your project or pilot project, which part of your project is taking place for policy intervention, also supporting the local community or the cooperative? We have to identify the specific site of the project. This is my question. Thank you.
Our last question. Oh, let's take the one question there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Céline from Biodiversity International. I have like a more general question, but I will apply it to the rice value chain in Senegal. And it was actually triggered by the question of the comment of our colleague there. If the shift is really away from millet into more and more rice consumption, me as a nutritionist, I have a bit of a problem with it because millet is nutritionally much higher than the white rice and everything they are consuming. So my question here is actually, if we look at particular value chains, like one value chain, just the rice, etc., that will never be enough to account for good nutrition. So my question is, how could the framework maybe be used to also take into account those nutritional shifts? Because in more and more countries we see, even in Kenya here, huge burdens of overnutrition, obesity, etc., due to staple food consumption and so on. So the question is, how could the framework possibly also take more into account dietary diversity and nutrition?
Okay, we'll take one more question. I think Kavita has a question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment for Priscilla. I think you raise a very interesting issue on the trade and institutional side of things, which was brought about yesterday when a colleague from Kenya actually talked about trade limitations and restrictions. And I think when you talked about the value addition that's actually not happening in the countries where cocoa is grown and is shifted to Europe, I think that's a very important story which is part of the system's description. And I think if we can create some messaging around that, it could be quite a powerful case study for framework testing, which shows the links between the systems. Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think I'll stop it there. It's 20 past. So what I would ask is this of the panelists. We will have a dedicated DevCo session. Now, with the kind of forbearance of the audience, I'd ask not to respond in detail to the technical questions, but if there are responses to framework questions, if you could put those. I don't want to ignore the questions that came, but maybe if we can just keep them in mind, either have bilaterals or bring them up in the DEFCO study, because we really have to close this in 5 minutes. So if I can give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes each in turn. So Priscilla, if I can start with you.
I think two of the comments raised were more of comments, which we'll discuss further in the policy section. But he raised questions about the study in Ethiopia, the geographical scope, where we focused on. This was more of a countrywide study. We did narrow down to one particular region because we want to provide policies that cut across the whole country. Only we differentiate by the production systems. And for the standards, in the presentation, yes, we focused more on the international standards, but in the policy section, we'll bring the dimension of also the national standards. Thank you.
Maybe briefly, there was no question on the livestock, but a reflection on all the questions, also about scope, like what do you take into account? I want to know why this or that chain. I think also relates to which kind of policy questions you want to answer, for who. And yeah, maybe it's something to, just a topic to discuss during the break, but how do you use the framework? And when do you decide to focus on this question instead of this other one?
Yes, and I very much appreciate the question that was asked, because I think that came up in our study, certainly from the stakeholders, from the woman farmer and from Jean-Michel. They're both very cognizant of what you have said. And I think part of a TEEB framework may be, at the very first step, is saying how much do we need to increase this commodity versus diversifying. The importance of the government of Senegal has made rice very much a priority, but we've had the input that fonio and millet are two crops that don't receive equal attention and could be very important in increasing in diet. So I think that should actually be the first question that's asked. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our panelists, if we may, for their time and presentations.